Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, brothers and sisters. Sitting out here on a cool, almost cold April evening. We tried to go out earlier today. It was cloudy and windy. And I was reminded today, and last few weeks actually, but today especially, of a poem that I've always loved by T.S. Eliot called The Wasteland. And while I'm waiting to figure out what to read next, because I don't really yet know what I want to read next with you, I thought maybe I'd read at least some of The Wasteland, maybe not all of it, but some of it. It's a great poem, one of T.S. Eliot's greatest poems, and was called the greatest poem of the 20th century by some folks. So T.S. Eliot was an American. I think he was from Missouri originally, and he was the son of a brick-making family. So he was set to inherit a great deal of financial security, should we say, and he gave it up because he wanted to go to England, thinking England was more exotic, more romantic in a way. He wanted that English life, something greater than this mundane brick-making stuff. And he went over to England and he got married to a lovely British girl, and unfortunately he ran into a foul of Bertrand Russell, who was one of the leading atheist intellectuals of the 20th century, early 20th century. And Bertrand Russell was also quite the womanizer. And Bertrand set T.S. Eliot and his wife Vivian set them up to live in a house, paid for their bills, things like that. And then he went about his womanizing with T.S. Eliot's wife, apparently. And it really, I think it hurt Eliot very badly to realize he'd not only been cuckolded, but cuckolded by the man who had taken care of them financially. And eventually he conspired to get his wife committed to an insane asylum. And, well, anyway, a lot of this poem has to do with that, but it also has to do with the changes that were occurring in society, in English and European society, in the early part of the 20th century. 1922, so right after the war, right after the First World War, 1914 to 1918. And he incorporates into this poem a great deal of references to Western culture, Western literature, many of which most readers can't access now at all, couldn't access even during his day without footnotes. Consequently, the references seem very obscure, but I think that's part of Eliot's point, because I think Eliot was creating a poem here that was supposed to reveal how cut off from our past we are. And it's like what C.S. Lewis points out with the Great Divide, not the Great Divorce, the Great Divide, where he talks about how the generations up until the 1920s shared together a heritage that goes way, way, way back, so that an ancient Greek had more in common with a man in the 1850s than a man in the 1900s had with a man in the 1930s. Lewis said there was that big a divide, cut off from our heritage and our culture. And I think Eliot felt that intensely there in England, where he thought he was going to find high culture, and he found really just misery and disappointment working as a bank clerk there in London. So he makes reference here to all sorts of works, Dante Alighieri, for instance, and he makes reference to Arthurian stories. He makes reference to Greek literature. He makes reference to Tiresias and the theme of Tiresias' conversion. He makes reference to Chaucer, one of the great English poets of the 1300s. So if one doesn't know all these references when you read this poem, the poem seems very strange and very, very obscure, especially on a first read. And even if you do know the references, there's a lot in the poem which is hard to fathom. Now, I'm going to read it, I think, tonight, at least some of it, like I said. I'm going to read it tonight as one who loves the poem. I don't read it as somebody who is going to explain everything, and I don't want to read it as somebody who says, I know all the references, nor can I say that I know all the languages, because he incorporates Italian and German and French into a Latin, Greek, into the poem. I can't claim that I can pronounce all of those correctly. So that's sort of a caveat here, that if you're watching this and you speak fluent German, well, Entschuldigung. So this was written after Eliot had made friends with Ezra Pound, the great poet Ezra Pound, 20th century. And he makes a reference to Ezra Pound here at the opening. And one thing I know for sure is that the opening of the poem, which has gone down in literary history as one of those more famous openings, is also a trope or a reference to Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer's poem, The Canterbury Tales, begins when April, with his sweet showers, has pierced to the root and bathed all in sweet liquor, then man longs to go on pilgrimages. Okay, in Middle English, one that appear with the sure suit, the drought of March hath passed to the root, and bathed every root, and swish the cure of which enchanted it is a floor, when Zephyr's egg with their sweat breath hath instilled in every holt, and hath the younger crops, and the sun hath his course in the Ramadan. Then pricketh, and then the small birds that maketh melody, which all the next doth sleep with open ye, then pricketh him in his garages, and go on man on pilgrimages. From every shearer's end of England they wended to Canterbury. The holy bliss for Martyr, for the sake for him that helped them when that they were sick. Middle English kind of sounds like ours, but not quite. So anyway, at the very opening here, Eliot is making reference to that poem, because Chaucer is saying that, look, when April comes and it gets warm, people who have been cooped up inside the whole time want to go outside, and they want to see other humans, and they want to frolic, and they want to frisk about. And he couches it in the sort of tongue-in-cheek, like they really want to go and be religious, and go on pilgrimages. And as we find, most of the pilgrims aren't really there for the religion part. But the pilgrimage was something which people engaged in. They got outside, they went to these holy sites and shrines. It was a happy, kind of festive affair, full of religious connection and connection to the past, and a rebirth after a long winter. So Eliot is making reference to that at the very beginning, that April is a month which stirs us into new life and makes us have to come alive after a long period of being asleep. So without further ado, I have my T.S. Eliot here, the complete poems that I picked up for a song and a dance, because everything's going digital now, so people are throwing books out like a rally in Germany in the 1930s. And I have my fortification, so hopefully you have yours and you're ready to go. So here we go. This is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, 1922. Nam sibilam quidem cumis ego ipse oculis meis vidi in ampula pendere, et cum illi pueri dicerent. Sibula te thales, respondebat illa, epothenein thelo. For Ezra Pound, Il Melior Fabro. Part 1. The Burial of the Dead. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade. I went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin gar kein Russen, stamm aus Litauen echt Deutsch. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. And he said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight, and down we went in the mountains. There you feel free. I read much of the night, and I go south in the winter. What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in, under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning, striding behind you, or your shadow at even rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu, mein Irish Kind, wo weilest du? You gave me hyacinths first a year ago, and they called me the Hyacinth Girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak, and my eyes failed. I was neither living or dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. Oren dir das mir. Madame Sosostris, famous clairvoyant, had a bad cold. Nevertheless, is known to be the wisest woman in Europe, with a wicked pack of cards. Here, said she, is your card. The drowned Phoenician sailor. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Look. And here is Belladonna, the Lady of the Rocks, the Lady of Situations. Here's the man with 3 staves, and here the wheel, and here's the one-eyed merchant, and this card, which is blank, is something he carries on his back, which I'm forbidden to see. I do not find the hanged man. Fear death by water. I see crowds of people walking round in a ring. Thank you. If you see dear Mrs. Equitone, tell her I bring the horoscope myself. One must be so careful these days. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs short and infrequent were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William's Street, where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours, with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. And there I saw one I knew, and I stopped him, saying, Stetson, you who were with me at the ships of Malai. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Now keep the dog far hence, that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You hypocrite lecture, mon semblable, mon frère. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. Part 2. A game of chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble, with a glass held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing. doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting the light upon the table, as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and colored glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange, synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents and odors, stirred by the air that freshened from the window. These ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into the lacquer area, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge sea wood, fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which, sad light, a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantel was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel, by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues. Jug, jug, to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls. Staring forms leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the stair. Under the firelight, under the brush, her hair, spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think. I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down. So, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess. Pressing lidless eyes and waiting for the knock upon the door. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I didn't mince my words. I said to myself, hurry up please, it's time. Now Albert's come back, make yourself a bit smart. You'll want to know what you've done with that money he gave you to have yourself some teeth. He did, I was there. You had them all out, Lil, and get a nice set, I said. Huh, I swear I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert, he's been in the army 4 years, he wants a good time, and if you don't give it him, as others will, I said. Oh, who's there, she said. Something like that, I said. And I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for like a telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, looking so antique. And her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already. Nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What do you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home. They had a hot gammon, and they asked me in to dinner to get the beauty of it out. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night, Tata. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. Part 3. The Fire Sermon. The river's tent is broken. The last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles. Sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed. And their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors, departed, have left no address. By the waters of Lehman, I sat down and wept. Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song. Sweet Thames, run softly, for I speak not loud or long. But at my back I hear, in a cold blast I hear, the rattle of bones and chuckles spread from ear to ear. A rat crept softly through the vegetation, dragging his slimy belly on the bank. While I was fishing in the Dog Canal, on a winter evening round behind the gas house, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him. White bodies naked on the low, damp ground, and bones cast in a little low, dry garret, rattled by the rat's foot only year to year. But at my back from time to time, I hear the sound of horns and motor cars, which shall bring Sweeney to Mrs. Porter in the spring. Oh, the moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and her daughter. They washed their feet in soda water. Et de ces voix d'enfants chantant dans la coupole. Twit, twit, twit. Jug, jug, jug. Jug, jug, jug. So rudely forced. Tereu. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter noon, Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant unshaven, with a pocketful of currants, CIF, London, documents at sight, asked me in demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi, throbbing and waiting, I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour, the evening hour, that strives homeward and brings the sailor home from sea, the typist home at tea time. clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out food in tins. Out of the window, perilously spread, her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan are piled, at night, her bed, stockings and slippers, camisoles and stays. And I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled dugs, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. And he, the young man carbuncular, arrives. A small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious, as he guesses. The meal is ended, and she is bored and tired. Endeavors to engage her in caresses which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense, and his vanity requires no response and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have for suffered all, enacted on this same divan or bed. I, who have sat by Thebes below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead, bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, fighting the stairs unlit. She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about her room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone. This music crept by me upon the waters and along the Strand, up Queen Victoria Street. Oh, city, I can sometimes hear, beside a public bar in lower Thames Street, the pleasant whining of a mandolin, and a clatter and a chatter from within, where fishermen lounge at noon, where the walls of Magnus Martyr hold inexplicable splendor of Ionian white and gold. The river sweats oil and tar. The barges drift with a turning tide, red sails wide to leeward swing on the heavy spar. The barges wash drifting logs down Greenwich, reach past the Isle of Dogs. Way-a-la-la-la, wa-la-la-la-la-la. Elizabeth and Leicester beating oars, the stern was formed, a gilded shell, red and gold. The brisk swell rippled both shores, southwest wind carried downstream the peal of bells, white towers. Way-a-la-la-la-la, wa-la-la-la-la-la. Trams and dusty trees. Highbury bore me, Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. My feet are at Moorgate, my heart under my feet. After the event he wept, and he promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? On Margate sands I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. La la. To Carthage then I came, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest. Burning. The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. Part 4. Death by Water. Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the cry of gulls, and the deep sea swell, and the profit and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers, as he rose and fell. He passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you. Well, the last attempt didn't really work too well, so I wanted to try it again. Technical issues on the last one, and also I think I don't know whether I like the idea of a performance of T.S. Eliot as much as I like just a reading of T.S. Eliot. So I wanted to capture something of the majesty and the, I think, power of that poem, but it's a little close to my heart, I gotta say. So I also wanted to capture something of this. I mean, it's a wild and woolly day out, filled with the ruah of God. The ruah is the breath of God that he breathes into the nostrils of Adam and Eve. And it's filled with that. You know, it's one of these days where the ozone is thick, as they might say in a modern context. So what I thought might be good, and also, it wasn't 5 o'clock yet. Now it's 5 o'clock, so here we are, right, with the fortifications and everything. Now, this is a Radler beer, by the way. It's a grapefruit-infused beer, and I've really taken a shine to it. It's what the bikers in France and Germany would drink at the end of one of their rides. So it's grapefruit mixed with beer, and you could have like lemon mixed with beer, orange juice mixed with beer, kind of like a champagne and orange juice, that sort of thing. Similar concept. Humans have been brewing or venting or distilling all sorts of booze from really early on in our history. It's like apparently evidence of some form of alcohol making goes way, 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 way back into our history. So we've always found some ways to make drinks a little bit more spiky. And that's what a Radler does. It gives you a refreshing bit of vitamin C along with your beer. So I thought today would be good to try this again. The wind is pretty high, and so I'm worried that the tripod might be knocked over and we might get cut off, but we'll try it again. And this time I'd like to capture, if I can, something of this wild and woolly sky rather than just me talking like a talking head. Not the band either, but this. This whole thing. Because, you get tired of that after a while, right? So, far more interesting to see the actual world. So let's try it. I'm going to flip the camera here. We'll see what happens. Boink. And there it is. The wild and woolly earth. We'll set the camera down. Hopefully it won't fall. The Wasteland. Part 5. What the Thunder Said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation is now dead. Oh, that's my wife. Hang on a second. Yes, I'm doing a live broadcast on Facebook.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you're on.
Woohoo.
Okay, I'm going to start over now.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Love you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Lassiter. Catch her on her own Facebook page. She makes occasional appearances unexpectedly in the middle of things. So there it is. And I love her for it. T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland, Part 5. What the Thunder Said. After the torchlight red on sweaty faces, after the frosty silence in the gardens, after the agony in stony places, the shouting and the crying, prison and palace and reverberation, a thunder of spring over distant mountains. He who was living is now dead. We who were living are now dying, with a little patience. Here is no water, but only rock. Rock and no water, and the sandy road, the road winding above among the mountains, which are mountains of rock without water. If there were water, we should stop and drink. Amongst the rock one cannot stop or think. There's not even silence in the mountains, but all thunder without rain. There's not even solitude in the mountains, but red sullen faces sneer and snarl from doors of mud-cracked houses. If there were water, and no rock, if there were rock, and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look up ahead on the white road, there's always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? What is that sound? High in the air, murmur of maternal lamentation. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is the city over the mountain? Cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air. Falling towers, Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. Unreal. A woman drew her hair out tight and fiddled whisper music on those strings, and bats with baby faces in the violet light whistled and beat their wings, and crawled head downward down a blackened wall, and upside down in air were towers, tolling reminiscent bells that kept the hours, and voices singing out of empty cisterns and exhausted wells. In this decayed hole among the mountains, in the faint moonlight, the grass is singing. Humped in silence. Then spoke the thunder. Da! Data. What have we given? My friend, blood shaking my heart, daring of a moment's surrender, which age of prudence can never retract. In this only we have existed, which is not to be found in our obituaries, or in memories draped by the beneficent cider, wheels broken by the lean solicitor in our empty rooms. Da! Dayadvam. I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think oh, swallow, swallow, le prince d'Aquitaine à la Tuileries. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then I'll fight ya. Hieronymo's mad again. Data, Dayadvam, Damyata. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. There are notes to this poem, and as a matter of fact, I've read before versions where the notes are they're just extensive, because it's hard to understand a great deal of what's going on in this poem without these extensive notes. And the editor here of my text, let's check out who that is for scholarly reasons. N'est-ce pas? There's a Harcourt, Brace, and World Incorporated, New York, edited by Esme. No. Edited by, I don't know who it is. Edited by somebody. It doesn't say. But the editor here provides notes that allow us to have some insight into what references he's making. Because throughout this poem, he's just making hundreds of references to various pieces of literature and cultural things that we don't have direct access to. So some of the things that work here, I thought it's interesting. This is back in the Burial of the Dead section. It says, I'm not familiar with the exact combination of the tarot pack of cards from which I have obviously departed to suit my own convenience. Must be T.S. Eliot's own note. The Hanged Man, a member of the traditional pack, fits my purpose in two ways. Because he is associated in my mind with the hanged god of Frasier, and because I associate him with the hooded figure in the passage of the disciples to Emmaus in part 5. The Phoenician sailor and the merchant appear later, also the crowds of people, and death by water is executed in part 4. The man with 3 staves, an authentic member of the tarot pack, I associate quite arbitrarily with the Fisher King himself. So one of the things that comes up over and over in the poem is this image of the Fisher King. And you see that in the Phoenician, Phlebas the Phoenician, and the sitting fishing by the arid plain behind him in the last part of the poem. And it's an image which Eliot discovered in the Arthurian cycle, the stories of Arthur and the court of Camelot. The Fisher King was a king who had a near lethal wound that would not heal, but did not kill him, and so it kept him alive in excruciating pain for years and years and years. And he was only healed when finally Perceval came and asked the right questions of the Grail ceremony. And when he did that, Perceval was allowed to have the Grail come to him, and he was able to give the Fisher King a drink from the Grail, the Holy Grail, which healed him immediately. And all the land around, which had become arid and dissolute, was suddenly refreshed, renewed. Rain fell on the land and it burgeoned with new life. Now, of course, the poem isn't explicit about this, but the hint of the poem is the Fisher King's wound is a sexual wound, that he's been hurt in his manly areas, and because of that, he is incapable of producing new life. He's incapable of engaging in love with his own wife, and he's incapable of ruling his land as a king ought to, because he has this terrible wound. The medievals were not nearly as squeamish about such things as we are, just for the record. And for them, it was perfectly obvious that a king who wasn't able to exercise his manly duty was not able to really rule with potency. The very word itself meaning manliness, potens, potency, possibility. So Perceval, who heals him through the Grail, does this great act of mercy that fixes everything and allows rain to fall on the land again. We go back to what Eliot was struggling with, his own personal issues, basically with impotence, and with his own wife that he had with Bertel, cuckolding him with his wife. But I think also he saw on a larger scale that there was this problem in Europe that was a problem of impotency, that we had become a culture, or Europe had become a culture that no longer had the power to rule itself. 1922, remember, the poem was written. And so the Fisher King becomes this thematic element in the poem, which kind of ties the poem together, because from the very beginning it's an important image. It ties the poem together and reminds the reader that there's this terrible wound that our culture is suffering through. You can extend it into America in our modern era, consequently. The terrible wound that we suffer through. What is it? Is it a sexual wound? Is it a wound of the heart? Is it an emotional wound? Is it the wound of abortion? Is it the wound of contraception, which leads to abortion? Is it the wound of our society's acceptance of infanticide or euthanasia or the cheapening of human life? I think the answer is yes. It's all that. That's the Fisher King, see. The Fisher King is this character who can no longer be fully human because he's lost that thing that distinguishes him as a man. And he needs Perceval, the original Arthur character, the original character of the Arthurian cycle, to heal him. Perceval was the great poem of Europe, by the way, not so much. It was really Perceval's character that everybody referred to. And the Arthur story is sort of modeled on that or crafted on that. So that poem of Percival, especially Wolfram von Eschenbach's version, was the poem that dominated the culture and was the one that they always referred to. So Eliot is making that part of his main imagery. But one of the other images he brings up is this image of the tarot deck and the cards and Madame Sosostris. And at the time of Eliot's writing, 1922, and just before it, there was a very powerful mystical presence in Europe, because Europe had drifted away from its Christian roots and no longer saw any meaning in Christianity itself, and consequently had turned to mysticism, which is a very different thing. Sort of getting in touch with the dead spirits and having seances and listening to the mediums that would tell us how to live our lives in accordance with the spiritual energies of the universe. It turns out, by the way, a little known fact, one of the major characters of that mystical movement, Madame Blavatsky, she had deep influences over a lot of people in Europe, including those who had suffered through World War I on the frontline trenches. And three characters in particular in Germany were very influenced by her, by the name of Adolf, Heinrich Himmler, and Joseph Goebbels, were deeply influenced by Madame Blavatsky. Does that mean that all mysticism is bunk or leads to Nazism? No, what it means, though, is that mystical element, which was a searching for meaning, I think, in the universe, led to some very dangerous, violent, murderous results. And again, it was because I think Europe had divorced itself in Australia, and he quotes from Parzival, the poem, and he says about Tiresias, the character Tiresias, although a mere spectator and not indeed a character, he is yet the most important personage in the poem, uniting all the rest of the poem. Just as the one-eyed merchant, seller of currants, melts into the Phoenician sailor, and the latter is not wholly distinct from Ferdinand, Prince of Naples, so all the women are one woman, and the two sexes meet in Tiresias. What Tiresias sees, in fact, is the substance of the poem. The whole passage from Ovid is of great anthropological interest, and then he has this whole Latin section that he quotes from Ovid. But the point being that Tiresias was a prophet, a Greek prophet, and Tiresias came across two snakes mating, and he struck them. And those two snakes that he struck were sacred to Hermes, the god Hermes, who then cursed him. Or maybe it was Apollo, I forget. But anyway, he cursed Tiresias, and Tiresias had to suffer by switching his form to a woman for several years. And then he switched back to a man. And that we see that image in what's called the caduceus, which is the image of the medical world. If you know two snakes bound around a staff with wings, it's the caduceus. It's a symbol of Tiresias, who is seen as a prophet and a healer in the ancient world. And in this poem, he's the prophet. He's the man who sees the patterns of the world, because that's what a prophet does. He sees the patterns. Anyway, continuing with some of the notes. He quotes also from Götterdämmerung,
and the Vicar of Wakefield, and he quotes from the documents about Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, Purgatorio, St. Augustine's Confessions, which is to Carthage, then I came, where a cauldron of unholy loves sang all about mine ears. He quotes from Buddha, which is, again, an interesting little bit of history, that Eastern philosophy, along with mysticism, had become very popular in Europe. And there was a whole movement called Easternism, where Europeans had become enchanted not just with China. Japan was unknown at the time, really. They were enchanted not only with China, but also with the Middle East and with Persia and all that, the culture there, Mesopotamia. And so he's basically quoting from the Buddha at one point. The Buddha has what's called the Fire Sermon. It says here, the complete text of the Buddha's Fire Sermon, which corresponds in importance to the Sermon on the Mount, from which these words are taken, will be found translated in the late Henry Clark Warren's Buddhism in Translation. Mr. Warren was one of the great pioneers of Buddhist studies in the Occident. Right? Occident that's us, it's the Western world. Orient is the Eastern world. Terms no longer used as much. But that's why we orient ourselves, and we go through orientation, because we're turning towards the East. You might ask yourself, well, why is that important? Why do we turn towards the East? It's because all ancient structures used to be oriented towards the sun and the stars, and you had to find out where the East was, where the sun rose, in order to be able to build your cathedrals or to build your cities, so that the sun would come through the doors on a specific day. That's why you see all the major cathedrals of Europe are oriented towards the east. Their major openings are towards the south, but their rose windows are towards the east. And then he quotes again from Confessions, and he says what the thunder said. He says, in the first part 5, 3 themes are employed: the journey to Emmaus, the approach to the Chapel Perilous, and the present decay of Eastern Europe. He goes on to quote all sorts of things, and here's something I thought was really interesting. He actually quotes from Shackleton, Ernest Shackleton. The following lines were stimulated by the account of one of the Antarctic expeditions, I forget which, but I think one of Shackleton's. It was related that the party of explorers, at the extremity of their strength, had the constant delusion that there was one more member than could actually be counted. That's where they're talking about who is that beside you, the shadow and all that. Ernest Shackleton's, if you ever want a really harrowing read, or you find this on Amazon, find out about Ernest Shackleton. It's a really fascinating story. He was searching for the South Pole, and his group, basically the ship, the Endurance, got stuck in the ice, got trapped in the ice, and was there for a year, basically. And before he was able to escape from the ship that was crushed by the ice, and he escaped north through the frozen ocean, the icy ocean, to Elephant Island, and his men stayed there on Elephant Island while he and a few people went north again to a small whaling outpost. And he got help. They were rescued. All the men survived. Ironically, they came back to the war that was ongoing, and they didn't have any recognition, because so many men had been killed on the back. Nobody cared that Ernest Shackleton and his men had survived. Such is life. Then here are some important things, I think, in understanding the poem. First is that the words data, dayadvam, damyata mean give, sympathize, and control. The fable of the meaning of the thunder is found in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. I'll mispronounce that. And a translation is found in a work by Deussen. So give, sympathize, and control. And then also notice that he starts off each one with a thunder, said da, 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 da. My friend who played the tabla back in college, it's an Indian drum, he says that all the beats on the drum have different names, each name corresponding to a specific type of on the drum. Da is the initial beat that you make. So that sound that he uses, da, which is also the opening of the words, data, diadvam, and damyata, is a drum sound, And if you want to listen to something spectacular, listen to Zakir Hussain doing a drum solo on the tabla, and you'll hear him sometimes sound out the drum beats, so you can hear what I'm talking about. Then he quotes from Purgatory, and he ends with this word shanti. And shanti is a word from Indian again, which says repeated as here, is a formal ending to an Upanishad. And it basically means something like the peace which passeth understanding, equivalent to that word. Shanti just means peace in Indian and Sanskrit. So lots of notes, and there are more notes that you can glean from other copies. Those are Eliot's own notes. Now, I guess I'll finish up here because it is chilly out. My goodness, it's cold. I'll finish up with this. Why is this poem at all important, especially in our era? First off, it broke the mold of what poetry was doing at the time. Most poetry of the 19th century and then of the early 20th century was extremely sentimental, very formalized. The last great poet was Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was a fantastic poet, but his poetry is very formalized, very structured, sometimes a little sentimental, as much as I love Tennyson. The great poetry of the earlier eras had assumed that people understood what they were referring to. So there's this kind of bulk of culture that everybody had reference to. And T.S. Eliot's poetry, not just this one but others, it broke that mold. He wrote in a style which not only did not have the same rhyme scheme or rhythm, but itself was making reference to things that people wouldn't have gotten immediately. And it sort of flows without structure. Consequently, the poem it's hard to refer to everything and what does this mean or what does that mean. It's rather you have to kind of take it as a whole and then come back to it again and again and again, I think. But it really changed the way poetry was thought about in the 20th century. My father didn't like T.S. Eliot at all, couldn't stand him. Thought that he had done damage to poetry and really wrecked what poetry was about by taking away that formal structure. But my father also couldn't deny that T.S. Eliot's poem rang into every other poem after him and every other song after him. I mean, you listen to modern music or music from the 60s and 70s, or you listen to even jazz music, for instance, like Dave Brubeck, and that musical format, which was so free form, so free flowing, really owes a great deal to what T.S. Eliot did. The Wasteland not only was a great poem in its own right, but it was a great poem in that it influenced so many artists afterwards and had a permanent effect on Western culture and Western poetry. So we owe him a great debt. I think it's a wonderful poem. It's a fantastic poem, and I'm more than happy to talk at length with anybody who had questions about it. What does this mean or what does that mean? But for now, I'm thinking it's getting chill out again. It's Minnesota, so we don't expect to get warm here until about July. And right now it's April, so we're still in the freezer. And I need to refresh myself with a little bit more Radler and get indoors. So I thank you all for joining me. I think what I will read next, I've thought about it a lot and looked at what I have in my library, which is in chaos right now. I think what I'll do next is read from Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula Le Guin. If you have a copy of that, that's great. I'll start tomorrow if I can. If you don't have a copy and you just want to listen in, I'll just be reading from her text and take it chapter by chapter. We'll go with that, without explaining a great deal. I mean, it's just a great story. And until we meet again, I thank you very much for joining me, and I hope you stay safe and stay healthy. God be with you. Oh, and do check out some of those websites that I'm always making reference to. So anyway, God be with you.